March 6, 1943, Gafsa, Tunisia. The first rays of sunlight broke across the dusty hills of North Africa as hundreds of American trucks rumbled through narrow, desert roads. Their cargo wasn't tanks or artillery. It was something just as important: fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, and food. Every mile these trucks traveled determined whether American soldiers could continue fighting. Standing beside one of the convoys was General George S. Patton. Unlike many senior commanders who focused only on battle plans, Patton paid close attention to something most people never thought about: the supply system. He believed that no army, no matter how brave its soldiers were, could defeat the enemy if it couldn't feed its men or fuel its vehicles. Patton often reminded his officers that victories were won long before the shooting started. Every successful attack depended on thousands of tons of supplies reaching the front exactly when they were needed. In North Africa, that was easier said than done. The desert punished everything: fine sand clogged truck engines, tires burst on sharp rocks, temperatures soared above 100 degrees during the day before dropping sharply at night. Long supply routes stretched for hundreds of miles across open terrain, where every delay threatened combat operations. A single broken-down fuel truck could halt an entire armored column. One missing shipment of artillery shells could leave infantry without fire support. Patton understood these dangers better than most commanders. He had spent years studying military history. One lesson appeared again and again: Napoleon's army suffered when supplies failed. During World War I, massive offensives stalled because ammunition couldn't reach the front. Even the strongest army became helpless when its logistics collapsed. Patton refused to let that happen under his command. Almost immediately after taking command of the U.S. True Corps following the defeat at Caserina Pass, he began changing everything. Uniform regulations became stricter. Vehicle maintenance became mandatory. Inspection schedules multiplied. But behind all those visible changes was another priority: supply discipline. Patton insisted that every truck be properly maintained before leaving its depot. Drivers were expected to know their routes, inspect their vehicles, and report mechanical problems immediately. There were no excuses. Fuel had to arrive. Food had to arrive. Medical supplies had to arrive. Because somewhere at the front, American soldiers were depending on them. Patton also believed that paperwork mattered almost as much as the supplies themselves. Every shipment had to be recorded accurately. Every crate had to be accounted for. Every gallon of gasoline had to be tracked. To some officers, these requirements seemed excessive. Why should a general worry about inventory reports while preparing for battle? Patton's answer was simple: if commanders didn't know where their supplies were, they couldn't know whether their army was ready to fight. His inspections became legendary. Without warning, Patton would appear at supply depots, motor pools, repair shops, or field kitchens. Nothing escaped his attention. He checked truck tires. He inspected food quality. He examined fuel storage. He questioned mechanics, cooks, warehouse workers, and ordinary soldiers. Rank offered no protection. If standards weren't being met, someone would answer for it. These surprise inspections had another effect. Everyone knew the general could arrive at any moment. As a result, discipline improved even when he wasn't there. The message spread quickly throughout the army. Patton expected excellence, not only from tank crews and infantrymen, but from every person responsible for keeping the army moving. Because in his eyes, logistics wasn't a support job. It was combat power. Every loaf of bread delivered on time meant another soldier with the strength to fight. Every repaired truck meant another convoy reaching the battlefield. Every full fuel tank meant another Sherman, tank advancing instead of sitting helpless beside the road. For Patton, the supply chain wasn't separate from the war. It was the war. And before long, that belief would prove itself during one of the greatest military advances of World War II. By the summer of 1944, Patton faced the greatest logistical challenge of his career. The Allies had landed in Normandy, but breaking out of the beachhead was only the beginning. Once American forces burst through the German defenses during Operation Cobra, Patton's newly activated U.S. Third Army surged across France with astonishing speed. His tanks didn't advance a few miles each day. Sometimes they covered more than 50 miles in a single day. It was exactly the kind of fast-moving warfare Patton had dreamed about for years. But every mile created a new problem. A Sherman tank could burn hundreds of gallons of fuel during continuous operations. Every artillery battery required thousands of shells. Trucks needed spare parts. Soldiers needed food, clean water, uniforms, medicine, and ammunition. The farther the Third Army advanced, the longer its supply lines became. Many of the major French ports were still in German hands, forcing Allied logistics units to unload supplies on the Normandy beaches and transport them hundreds of miles inland by truck. The roads were packed day and night. Convoys stretched as far as the eye could see. Dust covered everything. Drivers often stayed behind the wheel for 16 or 18 hours at a time, stopping only long enough to refuel before heading back toward the front. Patton understood something many people overlooked. A fast army could become a stranded army overnight. He constantly reminded his commanders that speed meant nothing if the fuel. Trucks couldn't keep up. That was why supply discipline became even stricter. Truck maintenance was enforced relentlessly. A vehicle that broke down because of poor maintenance wasn't simply an inconvenience. It delayed every truck behind it. Patton demanded that drivers inspect brakes, tires, engines, and fuel systems before every mission. Mechanics worked around the clock, often repairing vehicles under dim lantern light so they could return to the road before sunrise. Patton also insisted that supply officers think ahead. Instead of asking what the army needed today, they had to predict what it would need several days later. If they waited until tanks were already low on fuel, they had waited too long. This relentless focus on logistics helped make the Third Army one of the fastest-moving forces in Europe. But even Patton couldn't escape one harsh reality. By late August 1944, the advance had become so rapid that Allied supply lines struggled to keep pace. Fuel shortages became severe. Some American tank units were forced to stop, not because German forces had defeated them, but because they simply ran out of gasoline. Patton found the situation almost unbearable. He later wrote that his army could have advanced even farther if enough fuel had been available. To solve the crisis, Allied commanders launched massive transportation efforts. Thousands of trucks, many operating under the famous Red Ball Express, carried fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts from Normandy toward the advancing armies. These drivers worked under enormous pressure. Many drove through the night with headlights dimmed, navigating crowded roads in all weather conditions. Some were fired upon by German aircraft or encountered scattered enemy resistance, yet they kept moving. Patton never underestimated their importance. He knew that every convoy represented another day his army could stay on the offensive. Every successful delivery meant tanks could keep rolling, artillery could keep firing, and infantry could continue pushing east toward Germany. To Patton, logistics wasn't glamorous. There were no medals for unloading crates or repairing engines. But without those jobs, there would be no victories to celebrate. He often reminded his officers that courage alone could not win a campaign. Discipline, preparation, and dependable supplies were just as essential. As the Third Army raced across France, Patton's philosophy became impossible to ignore. The faster his soldiers moved, the more important every truck, every gallon of fuel, and every crate of ammunition became. The entire offensive depended on one simple principle. An army can only move as fast as its supplies. And soon, during one of the most desperate battles of the war, that lesson would be tested like never before. December 19th, 1944, Verdun, France. Freezing rain turned to snow as staff cars pulled into a crowded headquarters. Inside, Allied commanders gathered around a large map of Europe. Red markers showed German forces smashing through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The surprise offensive had caught many units off guard. Entire roads were jammed with retreating vehicles. Fuel dumps had been captured. Communication lines were breaking down. Thousands of American soldiers were suddenly surrounded or cut off. Among them was the 1st Airborne Division, at the town of Bastogne. The Germans believed the trapped Americans would soon surrender. General George S. Patton had other plans. When Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, asked how quickly the Third Army could turn north and relieve Bastogne, most officers expected a cautious answer. Instead, Patton replied with remarkable confidence. His army could attack within the 48 hours. Some commanders were stunned. Moving an entire field army in the middle of winter seemed almost impossible. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, artillery batteries, engineers, ambulances, and nearly 250,000 soldiers would have to change direction and begin a new offensive. But Patton had spent weeks preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. He never believed supply planning should wait until a crisis began. His logistics officers had already developed alternate routes, emergency fuel plans, and reserve supply schedules. Convoy commanders knew how to react if roads became blocked or bridges were destroyed. Preparation turned what seemed impossible into reality. Within days, long columns of American vehicles rolled north through snow-covered roads. The weather was brutal. Engines struggled to start in the freezing temperatures. Ice covered bridges and mountain roads. Visibility often dropped to only a few yards, yet the convoys kept moving. Truck drivers fought exhaustion as they hauled fuel, ammunition, winter clothing, and food toward the front. Mechanics repaired frozen engines by hand in the bitter cold. Engineers cleared blocked roads, while artillery units struggled through deep snow. Patton constantly demanded updates. How much fuel remained? How many trucks had reached the forward depots? Which roads were still open? Every report mattered. He understood that the relief of Bastogne depended not only on brave infantry and powerful tanks, but on thousands of support personnel working behind the front lines. Finally, on December 26, 1944, elements of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's 3rd Army, reached the defenders of Bastogne. The siege was broken. For the soldiers who had endured days of freezing weather, constant shelling, and dwindling supplies, the arrival of fresh fuel, ammunition, food, and medical equipment meant survival. It was one of the defining moments of the war. To many observers, the victory highlighted Patton's aggressive leadership, but Patton himself knew the deeper truth. The attack succeeded because the supply system held together under extraordinary pressure. Without disciplined logistics, the tanks would never have reached Bastogne. Without fuel, they would have stopped miles away. Without ammunition, the artillery would have fallen silent. Without food, exhausted soldiers could not have continued fighting. For Patton, this was the ultimate proof of everything he had preached throughout the war. Winning battles required courage. Winning campaigns required logistics. Looking back after the war, military historians would praise Patton for his bold tactics and rapid advances across Europe. Yet behind every famous victory stood an army of drivers, mechanics, engineers, cooks, warehouse workers, and supply officers whose work rarely appeared in headlines. Patton understood their value better than most commanders. He demanded strict supply discipline because he knew that wars were not won by generals alone. They were won by countless ordinary soldiers who ensured that every rifle had ammunition, every tank had fuel, every hospital had medicine, and every fighting man received his next meal. In Patton's eyes, discipline was never just about polished boots or perfect uniforms. It was about creating an army that could fight, move, and endure under any condition. Because when the decisive moment arrived, victory belonged to the force whose supply lines were as strong as its soldiers.